Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll do a little bit of an introduction and then Laura will turn it right on over to you. So I just want to welcome everyone. Good morning or evening, for depending where you are. It's morning where I am. Welcome to our presentation, our webinar that's presented by the International Society for Quality of Life Studies in partnership with the Happiness Alliance as well. Today's presentation is Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. Technically rigorous, policy relevant, and an investigation after 5 years. This is presented by Sabina Alkire, and I will turn that over in a moment to Laura, who will introduce her.
Beautiful, thank you, Jill. There you go. All right, so Sabina, thank you so much for doing this webinar with us. We're really honored that you're doing this. Sabina works with Karma Ura in Bhutan at the Gross National Happiness Commission to create the Gross National Happiness Index, which we know is changing the world and really has had a tremendous impact in transforming just even how we're thinking about government. So really grateful for this webinar and for your work. So I'll read your bio. So Sabina Alkire directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, a research center within the Department of International Development, the University of Oxford. Her research interests and publications include multidimensional poverty measure and analysis, welfare economics, SEM's capability approach, and the measurement of freedoms and human development. And she holds a PhD, we say a PhD, in economics from Oxford University, University of Oxford, and you're also a priest. Yeah, so really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's really a delight to be here and a delight to really have a chance for interaction. What we agreed is that I will present some slides in two parts. First, talking about whether the GNH is technically rigorous and what we've learned after 5 years. And secondly, talking whether it is policy relevant. And however, I'm aware that I'm presenting this in a sense on behalf of the Center for Bhutan Studies and GNH, Dasha Karma Ura and his team, Tsoki Zamno, Karma Wangdi, Jimmy Punso, many others who have done the real work of the survey, the intellectual work of conceptualizing GNH, and the technical work of analyzing it and of communicating it to many of the actors. So the slides that I use are with permission. They are online on grossnationalhappiness.com, and also online is the final report on the GNH Index. So first of all, I would want everybody to recognize that the idea of gross national happiness does, in a sense, come from Bhutan, from the legal code after the country was united. It already said that that is the purpose of the government, creating happiness. And His Majesty the Fourth King of Bhutan famously then recognized GNH to be more important than GDP. And therefore the constitution, which came out when the country moved to democracy under the leadership of the Fourth King, also embedded in it the idea of GNH. And His Majesty the Fifth King, who is currently supporting the democratic processes, continues to recognize the importance of the spiritual and the material development occurring side by side to reinforce and to complement each other. So the gross national happiness idea means well-being for all people in all dimensions of their being. And of course, it would also consider non-human entities as well. And so it's looking at trying to balance the very recognized and very important emphasis on material development with complementary emphases on social and spiritual and environmental and other aspects. So when Dasha Karma Ura articulated GNH, when it came time within that country's trajectory to bring it down to a measure, because before, in a sense, as he writes in the introduction to this current 2016 report on GNH, before it was embedded in the being of people. and they didn't need a measure because in a sense it was already a way of thinking. But now it must be more articulate as Bhutan is exposed more and more to the West. And so there are 9 domains of GNH, which in a sense together try to reflect the whole different spokes of well-being that make up a balanced person, not that, as we will see, each person that needs to participate in each one. So psychological well-being is subjective well-being, life satisfaction, positive and negative affect, and spirituality. Health is physical health and mental health. Time use is time working and time sleeping. Education is formal and informal education, and also knowledge and values and skills, so wider than Western concepts of education. Cultural diversity also includes norms, festivals, creative arts, and diversity. And community vitality is relationships among the family, among the communities, time and donations, and in volunteering. Good governance covers both perceptions of governments, but also objective service delivery, participation in elections, assessment of human rights and freedoms. The domain of ecological diversity looks at how people are affected by threats like fires or earthquakes, and to what extent they undertake ecologically friendly behaviors. And living standards includes income, financial security, housing, asset ownership, and so on. So these 9 domains then raise questions about how to measure them. And actually each of them are indicated by 2 to 4 indicators. And for each of the indicators, a sufficiency threshold is affixed, which identifies how much is enough. An idea that maybe is not comfortable in cultures where more is always better. But really what it is asking is, what is the minimum not to be deprived? What is the minimum that we think after which maybe individual happiness rises, but collective happiness maybe does not? So there's a comfort there with an idea that more is not always better. And like a multidimensional poverty index, the methodology underlying it is the same. So we start with a personal profile, in this case of 33 indicators and 9 domains. And if you think of a person, then each of these dark spots indicates they have achieved sufficiency in that indicator, and the whites indicate that they have not. So this particular person, for example, doesn't think that she prays, is not literate, doesn't have certain artisanal skills like painting or sculpture, and doesn't have a perception that the government has performed well, but has many, many achievements in the GNH portfolio. And so she has sufficiency in 84%. So we use these scores of well-being, in a sense, and then we identify different groups of people according to the levels of achievement that they have. And so, for example, she is considered deeply happy because she has achievements in more than 84%. And so these results identify a person as moderately or deeply happy, in a sense, happy by the GNH Index, if they've achieved sufficiency in 6 out of 9 domains. So roughly, that doesn't have to be all of them, but at least some of them, because each person is different and you don't need all to be happy. That's one of the insights. It's recognized that the GNH Index does not have a microscope into people's hearts. It won't be getting it right. It's just a measurement tool, and it is imperfect. But it's trying to make very visible the underlying philosophy so that if you disagree with it, you can improve it. So according to the 2015 results, 43.4% of Bhutanese enjoyed sufficiency in 6 or more domains. And that was a statistically significant increase from the 2010 score. And we can see this breakdown by the scores, that 8.4% were deeply happy and only 8.8% had achieved sufficiency in less than 50% of the domains. And we also look for those who are not happy or not yet happy. We look at what are their achievements. And on average, they achieve sufficiency in 57% of the domains. So like the MPI, these give us a measure with certain qualifications. So that's the methodology. And then just 1 minute on the results, and then we'll talk about, in a break, about technical rigor. So men are statistically significantly happier than women, and this is driven by higher achievements in education and in good governance. Across the districts, we see a range of different levels of happiness, which are different than the levels of poverty, because community and culture can be higher in the poorest regions. Rural areas have significantly lower levels of GNH due to their lower achievements in living standard and education. And across the Dzongkugs, there's quite a bit of equality when we consider the standard errors on the survey. But we can see that some places have statistically significantly higher rates of GNH than others. So that is an introduction to, in a sense, the methodology and its rigor. And I believe, Laura, we were going to pause briefly in case people had questions before we move on to the second half. Is that correct?
Whatever you want to do is good. Yeah. It's totally up to you. I have questions, but I'll wait till the end and other people ask. So.
Okay. If there are any points for clarification, maybe we take them now, and otherwise we'll go to the end.
So I'll ask a question while other people might want to chat, or you can unmute yourself too. But so maybe this is a malformed question, but I'm interested in including spirituality in the psychological well-being, and so what kinds of ways is spirituality being asked about, and what would that mean for the well-being indices in like the rest of the world, like the OECD Better Life Index and the the Gallup World Poll? How could that inform those indices?
So the indicator of spirituality is made up of if they consider themselves to be a spiritual person, how often they recite prayers and consider karma. In all of these, we had to ascertain that the questions were relevant to the different groups and the different religious groups across the country. And there's actually a concern in all surveys that people who are deeply spiritual tend to be deeply humble. And so they often will not say that they are very spiritual. So in Bhutan, as in many other places, there was a concern about that. And there was also a concern that in Bhutan, one common practice is to say Om Mani Padme Hum, one of the mantras. And they found that in different parts of the country, people who said the mantra considered themselves to be praying, and in other places they didn't. So there were some incomparabilities that was discovered in the cognitive questions that accompanied the survey. So we simply have to go with that, and so be sensitized to the ways in which the data may be imperfect. But this is a different kind. It's trying to get to behaviors and sort of the internal intention, rather than just do you consider yourself one religion or another. But it's trying to look at the intensity of practice in any religion or none. Mm-hmm. So you could be a highly spiritual atheist because of the nature, the beauty of nature, or of sport, or of romance. So that's, others will be more expert than we are, but in the context of Bhutan, that was what the Center for Bhutan Studies sought to capture in these questions.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And meditation, sorry, I forgot, meditation was also a part.
Yeah. So did we have any other questions?
I see one question in the chat box, which is whether education and high achievements in life are necessary for happiness. That's a very good question, Rajkumar Chitra, who asked it. When we identified the happiest people in Bhutan, we found that illiteracy was common. One of them was a potato farmer, and we have some vignettes in other presentations, not today. But they were rural and urban. They were of different age groups and in different occupations, but it was very clear that no indicator was necessary to really be in the deeply happy category. Education, the cutoff is 6 years. Yeah, but I think the one thing that I would want to mention to Rajkumar Chitra is that the happiness here is not only subjective happiness, but it's also an overall state of well-being. And so clearly if a person is subjectively happy, but in terrible poverty and destitution, then there might be some increase in well-being if they had a good roof and warm socks. So this is beyond the subjective well-being and subjective happiness. And in fact, when the same survey has the subjective happiness questions, and they may be interesting to an ISQOLS audience, and half of the people who were happy by the GNH Index did not have subjective happiness ratings of 7 and above. And so it was actually very distinct in terms of who it was identifying as happy. So that does ask for more research in terms of how we are using the happiness work. Okay, thank you so much. So I will move on and briefly share the remainder of the presentation, which is really looking more at one of the many findings. And as I mentioned, the Center for Bhutan Studies has shared these results with each of the 20 districts, with the different ministries in government. Dr. Karma Ura has also authored chapters on the policy and program screening tools, which the center has developed. CBS has also developed a tool of GNH for businesses in the corporate sector to use, and also share this internationally. So I'm just doing a little bit, one finding, so you get the idea, but I don't by no means mean to share all of what has been learned. So let's just look at the change between 2010 and 2015, and how is an index like this policy relevant? So first of all, if you look at the 9 domains, I told you that there was a growth in GNH. So we have GNH growth. We don't know how fast it is. We know economic growth and we know what's a strong rate or a slow rate, but this was the first time to measure GNH growth rates. So we will have to look at other examples and at Bhutan in future periods to know how strong it was. But what was interesting is that although there was a growth in 2 domains, there was a significant decrease. Those were community vitality and psychological well-being. And they decreased in relative and in absolute terms. And so if we look at community vitality, it's made up of 4 indicators: safety, family, community relationships, and donations. And you can see that it's the indicator of community relationships, this is 2015, this is 2012, that had the biggest decrease. So let's look at community relationships. It's comprised of a sense of belonging to the community and of trust in neighbors. And in terms of belonging, there's a 3-item response scale. It was very long, somewhat strong, or weak. And trust in neighbors in none, a few, some, or most of them. And we see trust in most of them had a very strong decrease in this time period. And also this very strong sense of belonging went down, although the somewhat strong went up. But really the change in belonging and in trust is important. And we can also see that there was a big decrease in rural areas. So with the penetration of roads, of electricity, with more thoroughfare perhaps, it has had an impact. So that is an example of how one indicator you can drill down into the details a lot more. And the other point to make is, let's look not at the 9 domains, but let's look at the 33 indicators that make up GNH. Now the stars are the level of significance. 3 stars is 1%, 2 stars is 5%, 1 star is 10%. And you see, for example, there was a statistically significant increase in the living standard indicators of assets, per capita income, and housing. And there was also statistically significant increases, for example, in good governance, in the delivery of services, such as water or sanitation or electricity. Statistically significant increases in culture, in the community relationships, in sleep, and in the number of healthy days. But there were statistically significant decreases in all of the psychological well-being indicators: life satisfaction, positive and negative emotions, and spirituality. The number of healthy days went up, but self-reported health went down. The perceptions of government went down hugely by 46 percentage points, but 20% of people reported having better services. So 2008, the country became a democracy, and it was the youngest democracy, and perceptions of government performance were good by 97% of the population. And so it was a fall out of the honeymoon phase, perhaps, of democracy. But it's worth thinking about. So understanding these is quite important. For example, why are the psychological well-being going down? It's a research question. Is it a change in frame of reference? Is it actually a decrement in the psychological because of the move to modernity, with the increase in anger and frustration and anxiety, and a decrease in generosity and joy? So there are many questions to be asked, and the spiritual practices are clearly going down, particularly among the younger population. And then there's an interesting research question about the mismatch between the health and the self-reported health. So objectively, health improved, self-reported health went down. That's probably a shift in the frame of reference, but again, it bears explanation. So these are, in a sense, some of the ways that just looking at the index, not even going into the next layer of tools that I described, does, ask questions about policy. Because there was a rise of the negative emotions, the anger and frustration. There were less donations. The community vitality went down because donations and belonging went down. And so the GNH Index, in a sense, paints a textured and intricate picture of how a society is changing, how the material things are going up. And multidimensional poverty, the numbers were just updated in December of this year. It's been reducing very strongly. It's been having really good, really strong reductions, and we are delighted by those. So the material aspects are going very well, but it basically then senses or raises to the level of societal conversation some of the other forces that may be changing. So it's a society in flux, and hopefully this index opens space for quite profound conversations on how to manage that. No, there's no one way forward. But it may be that this information leads to these kinds of discussions. So that's really what I wanted to share in the time that we have. And I'd like, as Laura suggested, to have a lot of time for interchange. So do I hand it back to you, Laura?
Oh no, I think best if you keep it, because that way you can go through your slides for people's questions.
Okay, very good.
So, Jill, do we have questions yet?
Nothing in the chat bar, but if anyone has a question, feel free. You can unmute yourself and ask at this time, or if you don't feel comfortable, feel free to write in the chat bar and we'll read it for you.
So while we're waiting, I have a question about, so the difference between what you're doing in Bhutan and what the World Happiness Report is doing, where they have those 6 factors: social support, income, perceived freedom to make life decisions, trust in government and business, donations, and then of course I'm going to forget one because it's a list of 6. So I have to forget one. So they're using those 3, and then they say that the income, the social support, and I think the trust in government and business are the more important ones. So they're putting a value like this. These have a higher impact on happiness, but you're not doing that with the Gross National Happiness Index, right?
No, I think the philosophy, and this is where there's a conceptual link in a sense to Amartya Sen's work, is that the philosophy is that well-being is inherently multidimensional. And that psychological states are one part of it, but not the only part. And so you need a balance across them. So it's not looking at the extent to which these determine a psychological state, or serotonin levels, or whether it's happiness or life satisfaction, evaluative, or meaning and purpose. It's more that each of these have constitutive value. I think the other difference perhaps is that there, in the happiness realm, there's a sense that happiness is a skill that can be learned. And that when the Bhutan brought together an international conference and a working group to develop ways that the GNH concepts could go internationally, that was something many of the participants found interesting. That sometimes we think, I fell into a puddle, I am happy, or unhappy, it's an accident, I can't really help. But it's quite different to be in a society that sees it as a skill that can be learned. And so that changes, in a sense, the way that happiness moves out into policy, because if people are unhappy, then you need to teach them this skill, because perhaps they've forgotten or they haven't learned through other ways.
Other questions? Sabina, is there a question that you would like to be asked?
I'm looking for the chat bar, but I seem to have lost it.
I don't see anything else in the chat. Oh, we have one more from Luis.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you want to read it, Jill?
Sure. Luis T says, what is the role of hierarchical powers plays into this research? It appears that some of these measures have to do with people feeling in control of their lives or autonomous somehow.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Yes, the mental health question, which is in the health domain, is the standard general health questionnaire, GHQ, 12-item code, which does have to do a little bit with people's sense of ability to shape their lives. And there are also the questions in some of the community questions have to do with that, to what extent you're, a part of that. And then there's the question on human rights. So there are different questions or indicators of the GNH survey. There are 124 survey questions underlying the 33 indicators. And so that is a part of it, that part of, the GNH and achieving it does require, in a sense of the person to be shaping their life, or at least not coerced in a negative way by those with whom they disagree in a way that they could not challenge or change. And there might be other ways of shaping that, but I think it's important. The other level of hierarchy is that because this is in the public domain, yes, the government, both national and at the Dzongkhag level and at the local level, has access to it, but there's also access to it in civil society, so that people can do something of their own. So not this year, but last year, after the results were announced on New Year's Day, there was a SMS sent out to everybody on some different networks saying how they could improve their GNH, and how each person individually could think about, what can I do to rebalance my life? And so this is trying to really engage everybody as a joint project in improving gross national happiness. I see there are other questions, so I'll stop there.
Okay, Javier says, can you give some examples where the index was used to implement or change a policy? Good question.
Yes, again, the colleagues from the Center for Bhutan Studies will have many, many more examples. One early change from the screening tool, which CBS developed for the Gross National Happiness Commission, which approves the different items, was the decision as to whether to join the WTO, World Trade Organization. And that decision, they decided in the end that it was not clear that joining would increase GNH. And so they decided not to join. So that was one policy change. Another, I believe, was mindfulness. So mindfulness in schools, because the new generation had lower levels of spiritual practices. And given the changes in culture, there was an interest in reintroducing mindfulness into the school curriculum. It had been done, but in a different way, perhaps earlier. And so that then became a part of the school curriculum, which had been shaped by a Western influence in the meantime.
Any other questions?
Okay. Well, Sabina, we're really, again, very, very grateful. And as this work progresses, and if we continue to do the webinars, it would be really nice to come back and revisit to hear your thoughts and what, what happens maybe next year if we continue with the webinars. So
that would be wonderful. And also my colleagues in Bhutan are working on this gross national happiness tool for the business community. And it might be interesting to the ISQOLS audience to see how some of this work is also gaining interest in the corporate sector, both within Bhutan and also outside. But the idea is that they also, both among their employees and in ethically reflecting on their business practices, they can help the society to pursue GNH structurally in very new and innovative ways.
Yeah, like when you said that they're doing this with business, I feel very relieved. So one of my personal concerns is that it will become co-opted and used to increase profits and then increase environmental degradation and social and economic inequality. So yeah, would love to host a webinar with you talking about that anytime you want.
Thank you so much.
Really grateful for the work that you're doing, and really grateful to Bhutan for taking such an amazing role in the world.
And for those listeners who were not here at the beginning, all of the documents behind this are online at grossnationalhappiness.com, which is the website where the Center for Bhutan Studies and GNH Research posts their publications. And so there's also a lot more information available on that site. So do visit that if you are interested.